On a stormy night in 1971, a man in a dark suit boarded a plane and vanished into legend. With nothing but a briefcase, a fake name, and a parachute, he defied the system, outsmarted the FBI, and became America's greatest unsolved mystery. But what if the truth was always closer than we thought? What if the ghost we called D.B. Cooper had a face, a name, and a hidden life? This is the story of the man who fell from the sky and the shocking secret that stayed buried for over 50 years. It was the eve of Thanksgiving, the November 24th, 1971, a date that would etch itself into American history. The Portland International Airport buzzed with travelers eager to reunite with loved ones, arms filled with gifts, hearts set on holiday cheer. But amid the ordinary chaos of holiday travel, one man boarded Flight 305 bound for Seattle, and with him he carried a secret that would grip the nation for decades. He was unremarkable at first glance, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a dark suit, wearing a neatly pressed white shirt, a black clip-on tie, and polished shoes. His hair was dark-combed neatly to the side, and he wore a pair of sunglasses despite the cloudy November sky. To the crew and passengers, he seemed like any other businessman making a quick flight across the Pacific Northwest. He bought a ticket under the name Dan Cooper. No ID was required in those days. No one paid him much attention as he settled into seat 18C toward the rear of the cabin of the Boeing 727. Flight 305 was nothing special. A short 30-minute hop from Portland to Seattle, operated by Northwest Orient Airlines. A standard flight routine in every way. But today, the mundane would give way to a story so extraordinary that it would baffle generations. As the aircraft climbed into the gray sky, Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda and quietly watched the world fall away beneath him. The cabin hummed with the familiar sounds of air travel, the rattle of the cart, the low murmur of conversations, the steady thrum of the engines. No one suspected that within moments this man's next move would change American aviation forever. A few minutes after takeoff, Cooper caught the attention of a flight attendant. He handed her a folded note. She smiled politely, surely just another businessman trying to pass his phone number or a friendly greeting. She tucked the note away without reading it, but Cooper, leaning in close so that only she could hear, uttered words that made her blood run cold. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The world seemed to slow as she unfolded the note. Neatly written in capital letters, the demands were clear and chilling: $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserves, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the jet for the next leg of the journey. He warned that if his demands weren't met, he would detonate the bomb and bring the plane down, killing everyone on board. When the flight attendant hesitated, trying to mask her fear, Cooper calmly opened his black briefcase, just enough for her to glimpse inside. Wires, cylindrical red sticks, a battery. It could have been dynamite. It looked real enough to her, and that was all that mattered. She nodded, steadying herself, and walked slowly to the cockpit. The pilots listened in stunned silence as she relayed the message. Captain William Scott, an experienced aviator, kept his voice calm as he radioed in the hijacking code to air traffic control. In minutes, the FBI was alerted. The flight was no longer just a commercial journey. It was now the scene of a federal crime unfolding at 10,000 feet. The passengers, oblivious to the drama playing out, chatted, read magazines, and gazed out the windows as the Boeing 727 maintained its course. The flight crew, under Cooper's instructions, kept the cabin calm. There were no screams, no panic, only quiet tension behind the cockpit door. As the jet neared Seattle, the authorities scrambled on the ground. The FBI prepared the ransom money, $200,000 in $20 bills, their serial numbers recorded for tracking. The parachutes were sourced from local skydiving schools and the military. No one knew if this was the plan of a deranged madman or a cool, calculated operator. But they weren't going to take chances. The plane circled the Seattle airport for hours as the preparations were completed. Cooper remained calm throughout, sipping his drink, smoking cigarettes, chatting politely with the flight crew. He seemed knowledgeable about the aircraft, the route, the procedures. Not once did he raise his voice or show aggression. It was this chilling calmness that would later add to the legend. Finally, with the ransom assembled and the parachutes delivered, the jet landed in Seattle under Cooper's instructions. The passengers were released none the wiser that they had just shared a cabin with a man who threatened to blow them all to kingdom come. They walked off the plane unharmed into the drizzly night, where agents waited to question them. But Cooper wasn't done. With only a skeleton crew left on board, Captain Scott, the co-pilot, a flight engineer, and a single flight attendant, Cooper issued his next orders. He instructed the crew to fly south toward Mexico City at a low altitude of 10,000 feet and with the landing gear down. He knew what he was doing. This was the perfect setup for what came next. As the plane lifted off once more into the storm, the rain lashed against the fuselage. The wind howled and the engines strained against the turbulent night. Somewhere over the forests of southern Washington, Cooper ordered the cabin depressurized. He directed the flight attendant to join the cockpit crew and stay there. He strapped the ransom money, a heavy canvas bag packed with cash, around himself, donned one of the parachutes, and at 8 p.m. lowered the rear stairs of the jet. And then he jumped. Into the freezing rain, into the pitch-black night, into history. By the time the plane landed safely in Reno, hours later, Cooper was gone. No trace of him remained save for a black clip-on tie left behind on his seat. The man who had hijacked Flight 305 vanished, swallowed by the darkness and the storm, leaving the crew shaken and the FBI scrambling for answers. What had just happened? How had one man pulled off a heist at 10,000 feet, escaped into the night, and sparked what would become America's greatest unsolved mystery? As dawn broke over the Pacific Northwest, the largest manhunt in U.S. history was already underway. But D.B. Cooper, whoever he truly was, had disappeared without a trace. And so began the legend of the man who outsmarted America. Night fell heavy on the forests of Washington, the rain relentless, the wind cutting through the trees like 1,000 knives. Somewhere out there beneath the storm, a man had fallen from the sky carrying a bag stuffed with cash and wrapped in mystery. But as the hours turned to dawn, it became clear that D.B. Cooper wasn't just a skyjacker. He was about to become a legend. Within minutes of Flight 305's safe landing in Reno, Nevada, the FBI was in full motion. Agents rushed to coordinate with local law enforcement. Helicopters were scrambled to search teams, deployed bloodhounds loaded onto trucks. The dense forests and rugged terrain of southwestern Washington would soon become the focus of one of the most extensive manhunts in American history. But there was a problem, a big one. No one knew exactly where Cooper had jumped. The storm had masked his escape. The crew could only estimate their location, and with the plane traveling at night through a squall, the margin of error was massive. The drop zone could have been anywhere across miles of wilderness. The thick canopy of pine trees, deep river valleys, and rocky ridges offered endless places to vanish. Still, the search began. The FBI set up a command post and coordinated hundreds of personnel, federal agents, state troopers, National Guard units, paratroopers, and local volunteers. Helicopters buzzed low over treetops. Bloodhounds sniffed along riverbanks and logging roads. Small towns became staging grounds for search parties. The media descended, setting up cameras, broadcasting updates to a nation captivated by the mystery. And then came the first twist in the legend, the name. On the hijacker's boarding pass was written Dan Cooper. That was the alias he'd given. But as reporters rushed to break the story, an error slipped through a wire service miscommunication turned Dan into DB. The mistake stuck, and so was born the name that would haunt American folklore, D.B. Cooper. A name that sounded more like an outlaw, more like a ghost than an ordinary man in a dark suit. Days turned into weeks. The FBI chased every lead. Witnesses were interviewed over and over. Every skydiver, ex-military man, and known troublemaker within hundreds of miles was questioned. Suspects were brought in, interrogated, fingerprinted. But time and again, agents hit a dead end. Cooper left behind no boot print in the mud, no torn scrap of his parachute tangled in a tree. The dense forests seemed to have swallowed him whole. No body, no gear, no money, no clues. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Still, the FBI didn't give up. They mapped potential landing zones. They studied wind patterns, flight paths, terrain. They scoured rivers, convinced that if Cooper hadn't survived the jump, his body, or at least some evidence, would eventually surface. But nothing came. Meanwhile, the legend grew. The media painted Cooper as everything from a criminal mastermind to a folk hero. A man who defied the government. A man who beat the system. A modern-day outlaw who vanished into the wilderness with his prize. Americans already weary of war scandals and distrust in their leaders found something strangely thrilling in Cooper's story. He became a symbol of rebellion, a man who got away. Tips poured in from across the country. More than 1,000 suspects passed through the FBI's files. Some were promising at first glance: a former paratrooper with a criminal record, a drifter with a grudge against the airlines. One man even confessed on his deathbed, claiming to be D.B. Cooper, only for agents to discover he'd made it all up for attention. The FBI checked handwriting samples, ran polygraphs, tracked down serial numbers on $20 bills. Each time, the leads led nowhere. For nearly a decade, the case remained open, but the trail grew colder with every passing season. The Pacific Northwest moved on, but the myth lingered. The man who had fallen from the sky had become America's great unsolved riddle. And then, in 1980, a glimmer of hope emerged. A family out camping along the Columbia River, not far from Vancouver, Washington, watched as their 8-year-old son dug in the sand on the riverbank. His small hand struck something unusual, bundles of bills, weathered, decayed, but still bound together with ancient rubber bands. The family called the authorities. The FBI took the bills, ran the serial numbers, and the results sent chills down their spines. The money matched the ransom given to Cooper nearly a decade earlier. It was the first physical evidence from the skyjacking to ever surface. The bundles contained nearly $6,000 of the stolen $200,000, badly deteriorated but unmistakable. How had it gotten there? Had the river carried it downstream? Had Cooper stashed it deliberately, only to lose it later? Or was it proof that Cooper had perished that stormy night, his prize scattered by nature? The discovery reignited the investigation. Search teams combed the Tennabar area where the money had been found. Divers explored the murky depths of the Columbia River. Forensic experts studied the decayed bills, hoping they'd reveal some clue, anything that could point to Cooper's fate. But no new answers came. No further trace of the man, the parachutes, or the rest of the money appeared. Despite the renewed effort, the case again fell silent. In 2016, after 45 years, the FBI finally made the decision. The investigation was officially closed. The man known as D.B. Cooper had won. He had become what so few criminals ever do, a legend forever out of reach. But as the files were boxed and shelved, no one could have predicted that just months later, a forgotten thread would be pulled and the mystery would roar back to life. For somewhere, someone else was preparing to challenge the official story. A man who refused to believe that Cooper was gone. A man who was about to find something hidden in plain sight, a clue that would change everything. Spring came to America in 1972, but the chill of D.B. Cooper's mystery still hung in the air. The FBI's files on the case were thick with dead ends. The nation's most famous fugitive had simply vanished, leaving behind a trail of speculation, frustration, and folklore. But then, just 5 months after Cooper's daring leap, a man boarded a different plane with a plan that felt all too familiar. His name was Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr., and his actions would ignite new questions that burned hotter than ever. April 7, 1972, United Airlines Flight 855 prepared for takeoff from Denver, bound for Los Angeles. The Boeing 727 sat on the tarmac as passengers boarded, unaware that one of them carried a secret that would soon shake the aviation world once again. McCoy, clean-cut, dressed in a business suit, blended in easily. Like Cooper before him, he chose a flight aboard a 727, the same model, with the rear stair feature that had allowed Cooper's escape. As the jet climbed into the sky, McCoy moved with calm precision. He summoned a flight attendant and, without raising his voice or causing alarm, handed her a note. The message was chilling in its simplicity. "I have a bomb." His demands echoed. Cooper's almost exactly cash parachutes, a refueled aircraft ready to fly again. But McCoy wanted more $500,000 in ransom. He wasn't shy about upping the stakes. The plane landed in San Francisco as authorities scrambled to meet his conditions. The ransom was delivered, the parachutes provided, and the passengers released. Like Cooper, McCoy directed the flight crew to take off once again, this time pointing the aircraft toward New York, but that wasn't his real destination. Somewhere over the vast Utah desert, McCoy made his move. Donning a jumpsuit and helmet he had hidden in his luggage, he gathered his money, strapped on a parachute, and lowered the rear stairs. Into the night sky he leapt, vanishing into the dark like the ghost who had come before him. But McCoy was no D.B. Cooper. While the plan mirrored Cooper's to an uncanny degree, McCoy's execution lacked the same clean precision. He made mistakes, small ones, but costly. A handwritten hijack note was left behind in the cockpit. Fingerprints were found on a drinking glass he'd used during the flight. And those mistakes gave the FBI the break they'd been waiting for. Within days, agents had a name. Richard McCoy, Jr., 29 years old, a Vietnam veteran helicopter pilot, devout Mormon husband, father and law student at Brigham Young University. To his neighbors in Provo, Utah, McCoy was the picture of the American dream. To the FBI, he was their man. The arrest came swiftly. Agents stormed McCoy's home, finding him calm, collected, as if nothing had happened. The evidence was overwhelming. The ransom money, neatly bundled, was found in the house. The jumpsuit and gear matched what witnesses had described. The fingerprint match sealed the deal. But as McCoy sat in custody, facing a mountain of charges, a deeper question began to stir. The similarities between his crime and the Cooper case were impossible to ignore. The same type of aircraft, the same use of rear stairs for escape, the same style of note, the same calm demeanor. Was McCoy simply a copycat, or had he been Cooper all along? The FBI, eager to tie up loose ends, officially rejected the idea. Their reasoning was clear. Witness descriptions of Cooper painted him as older, mid-40s, olive skin, dark hair. McCoy was in his 20s, fair-skinned, lighter-haired. Handwriting samples differed. The motives seemed different, too. One hijacker asked for $200,000, the other $500,000. One vanished forever. The other was caught in days. But for many, including some agents working the case, the differences weren't convincing enough. Couldn't a clever criminal alter his appearance? Couldn't he change his tactics just enough to throw off suspicion? And weren't the similarities too precise to be coincidence? Richard McCoy went to trial. The jury took little time to convict him. He was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. But McCoy's story didn't end there. 2 years into his sentence, McCoy made his most daring move yet. With the help of other inmates, he hijacked a garbage truck and broke free from the penitentiary. The escape set off another massive manhunt. This time, the law caught up with him in Virginia. Cornered McCoy exchanged gunfire with FBI agents. The shootout ended with McCoy dead on the floor of a house he had tried to use as his last refuge. It was 1974. The case of Richard McCoy Jr. was closed, or so it seemed. Yet the questions lingered. If McCoy had been capable of orchestrating a skyjacking so similar to Cooper's, was it really so far-fetched to believe he had done it before? Did the man who died in that shootout take the secret of D.B. Cooper's identity to his grave? The official answer was no. But for many, including those who would later dig deeper into the files, McCoy remained the most tantalizing suspect. A man who fit the profile too well to ignore. A man whose final leap into the night might not have been his first. And as the files gathered dust and the myth of Cooper hardened into legend, someone out there wasn't ready to let the story end. Someone who believed that McCoy was the key to unlocking the truth once and for all. Decades had passed. The world had changed. New technology, new crises, new mysteries, but through it all, one legend refused to fade. The name D.B. Cooper still echoed in documentaries, books, and late-night conversations. The man who vanished into the storm remained America's most captivating outlaw. Officially, the case was cold. The FBI had closed the file in 2016, exhausted and empty-handed after 45 years of searching. But not everyone was willing to let it rest. One of those people was Dan Grider. A retired commercial pilot with more than 24,000 hours of flight time, Grider knew the Boeing 727 inside and out. He was also a YouTuber sharing his knowledge of aviation with an audience hungry for insight. But behind the flight tips and technical breakdowns, Dan carried an obsession, the mystery of D.B. Cooper. He wasn't in it for fame or clicks. He believed the truth was still out there, buried beneath decades of rumors and dead leads. And he believed he could find it. Grider approached the case like a pilot planning a mission. He gathered flight logs, terrain maps, weather reports from that fateful night. He studied wind speeds, escape scenarios, parachute models. He pored over declassified FBI files and unearthed details most had forgotten or overlooked. What he saw convinced him that one man had been wrongly dismissed, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. The similarities between Cooper's hijacking and McCoy's were too precise to ignore. The same aircraft, the same rear stair exit, the same demands, the same calm demeanor under pressure. Could those parallels really be coincidence? Dan didn't think so. He became convinced that McCoy wasn't a copycat, he was the original, D.B. Cooper. Still convincing the world would take more than a theory. It would take evidence. Hard evidence. And then came the breakthrough. It started with a hunch. Grider traced McCoy's history, searching for any loose threads. That's when he learned of a storage unit in Utah, once owned by a woman with ties to McCoy's family. The unit had sat untouched for years, filled with old boxes and forgotten belongings. Grider's gut told him it was worth investigating, and what he found inside would send chills down his spine. There, buried beneath yellowed books and dusty memorabilia, was a parachute. Not just any parachute, but one that matched the FBI's description of the gear Cooper had taken on his jump in 1971. A military-style rig with strange modifications, reinforced cord loops, unusual harness clips, details that had been noted quietly in FBI reports, but never shared widely with the public. Details that now sat in front of Dan Grider. But it wasn't just the parachute that made his heart race. It was where it came from. The storage unit's connection to McCoy's family. If this chute had belonged to Cooper, and if it had been in McCoy's orbit all along, then maybe they were the same man. Grider didn't stop there. He kept digging. He contacted skydiving experts, asking them to examine the chute. Their verdict, the modifications, were rare. They fit what the FBI had documented, and they weren't something a casual jumper would bother with. They were the work of someone who knew parachutes, someone like McCoy, a decorated helicopter pilot and skydiving instructor who had made hundreds of jumps. The pieces began falling into place. A man with the skill, the nerve, the opportunity, and now the gear. Still, Grider knew he needed more. He reached out to McCoy's family, emails, letters, messages through friends, but at first there was nothing. Silence. And that silence spoke volumes. They weren't just protecting a name. They were protecting something bigger, a secret that had shaped their lives in ways no one else could see. And then, just as Grider was about to hit another wall, he made one more discovery. Another parachute. This one hidden in an attic tucked behind boxes of old Christmas ornaments in a grandmother's house in Provo. A canvas bundle tied with care, forgotten by most, but not by Grider. When he laid it out, the stitching, the rigging, the worn straps, they all matched. Another piece of the puzzle, another link to McCoy. The evidence was overwhelming, at least to Grider. But what about the FBI? What about the world? So Dan did what he did best. He went public. He shared his findings in a video that quickly went viral. Millions watched as he laid out his case. The parallels, the gear, the family ties, the confession he was still chasing. And this time, the world listened. The FBI couldn't ignore it. Agents returned to the case, collecting the chute, sending it for analysis at Quantico. Plans were drawn up to seek DNA comparisons, to exhume McCoy's remains, to test samples from his children. The question that had haunted America for half a century was suddenly alive again. Was Richard McCoy really D.B. Cooper? For Grider, it was never about fame. It was about the truth, about honoring the pursuit of answers in a case where so many had given up. And as the tests began, as experts combed over the evidence, one thing became clear: the legend of D.B. As Dan Grider's video spread like wildfire across the internet, the world watched with bated breath. Could it really be that after more than 50 years, America's greatest unsolved mystery was on the verge of being cracked? The parachute, the storage unit, the attic discovery, each piece pointed in one direction. But Grider knew the final piece of the puzzle didn't lie in a storage locker or an FBI file. It lay within the hearts of those who had lived with the secret the longest, Richard McCoy's family. At first, they resisted. McCoy's children, Shantae and Rick McCoy III, had lived their entire lives under the shadow of their father's double identity. To the world, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was a war hero, a loving husband, a father who'd read bedtime stories and coached Little League. But to them, he was also the man who had pulled off one of the boldest crimes in American history, and possibly two. Grider reached out again and again, not with accusations, not with demands, but with respect. He knew that what he was asking of them wasn't easy. To speak the truth would mean reopening old wounds. It would mean risking judgment scrutiny and the loss of the myth that had in some strange way protected their family all these years. And then finally the silence broke. It was Rick McCoy III who spoke first. A quiet conversation away from cameras and headlines. A moment of honesty that had been building for decades. His voice was low, heavy with emotion. We never wanted to believe it, he admitted. But the more we looked at everything, it's all there. He was Cooper. He had to be. We always kinda knew. The admission hit like a shockwave. The final confirmation Grider had chased for years had come not from files or forensics, but from the source that mattered most. The family no longer needed to protect the secret. Their mother had passed, and with her gone, so too had the fear that speaking out might bring harm or shame. Now it was about peace, about letting go of the weight they had carried. News of the confession spread rapidly. Grider's follow-up video went viral within hours. The legend of D.B. Cooper was no longer faceless. The ghost had a name, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., but the confession was just the beginning. The FBI, already stirred into action by Grider's discoveries, moved quickly. The parachutes were sent to Quantico for detailed forensic analysis. The infamous clip-on tie Cooper had left behind on Flight 305, long archived but never forgotten, was retrieved and re-examined. The partial DNA samples taken from the tie decades earlier were now compared to genetic material provided by McCoy's children. Plans were quietly discussed to exhume McCoy's remains for a definitive test. The mood inside the Bureau shifted. After so many years of frustration, there was new energy, new hope that the case that had haunted generations of agents might finally be closed. And yet the tests would take time. Science moves at its own pace. But even as they waited, the weight of evidence, physical, circumstantial, and now personal, was undeniable. For many, including former agents who had worked the case in its early days, the matter felt settled. McCoy was Cooper. But what did that mean? What was the man behind the myth really after? Some saw Cooper's hijacking as the act of a desperate man, a cry for control in a world slipping into chaos. A Vietnam vet who had seen too much given too much and wanted something back from a country that had used him up and left him behind. Others saw it as pure thrill-seeking, the ultimate adrenaline rush from a man who lived on the edge. And still others saw it as the perfect crime, a brilliant plan executed with precision, at least the first time. In truth, perhaps it was all of those things. Richard McCoy Jr. was no ghost. He was a man flawed, driven complex, a man who balanced duty and danger, a man who in his own way became both hero and outlaw. For Grider, the conclusion of his investigation wasn't about tearing down a legend, it was about honoring the truth. The legend of D.B. Cooper had always offered something comforting, a mystery that defied the system, a man who vanished beyond the government's reach. But in the end, it wasn't magic that let him disappear. It was skill, training, planning, and perhaps just a bit of luck. And what of McCoy's family? Their decision to speak wasn't about seeking attention or rewriting history. It was about finding peace, about finally stepping out from behind the shadow of a secret they had never asked to keep, about allowing the truth to breathe, even if it meant reshaping the story America thought it knew. As the dust settled, as the tests continued, and as the legend of D.B. Cooper took on new meaning, one question lingered, a question that might never fully be answered. What else did McCoy get away with? And how many more secrets lie buried waiting for someone like Grider to unearth them? Because even if the face behind the legend is known, the echoes of the mystery will remain whispers of a man who fell from the sky, and in doing so, rose into myth.